Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here. Alright, welcome back to part 2 of my look at Dungeons of Infinity. So since the last video, I have played 3 full games, 2 scenarios. One I've played once, one I've played twice. I won the first one and I lost both of the second ones. But I think I am in a position now to give somewhat of an informed opinion of what I actually think of Dungeons of Infinity. And for the most part, I think this is a pretty good game. It is unfortunately, I think, hamstrung a bit by some not so clear rules. Some of the documentation is lackluster, and it just has a few problems. But I think it's about 90% there, and I think with a good, like, just some solid time spent with a second edition, getting things in better order, getting some of the errors corrected, I think this could be a very good to great game. And I'm looking forward to the future of the game. I think it's in good hands with Jack. I do think maybe he just, this was his first game he made, and there were some stumbling blocks that just didn't really appear to him until maybe after the game was already completed and into the hands of the general public. But let's talk about some things that I really like about the game first. I love the way that the random dungeon is laid out while you are playing the scenarios that use a random dungeon. So there are, I believe, 30 or so different dungeon tiles, and these are pretty small. So it is nice that the dungeon doesn't take up a lot of room on the table, because your characters and the combat takes up a ton of room on the table. So I do like that these are small tiles. I do like that you move from tile to tile. You're not moving from space to space, so that is nice. It doesn't simulate, or you don't need to worry about like tactical decisions as far as your facing or your where you are in the tile. So that is nice. It's more of a there's more of a kind of puzzle element to moving around. But each of these tiles will have a number associated with it, except for the special tiles, which allow you to do special things. And each one of those numbers you can look up on 4 different little charts here, and that will tell you what you discover in each room. And there are 4 different standard charts that will tell you the kinds of risks you are going to find, and each one of these is associated with a different deck of cards, and those are over there. Those are the risk cards. And so as you move through the dungeon, you are going to be laying new tiles through movement, and the blue arrows have to match up with the direction you are going, the direction you are exploring. And then you consult the number of the tile you just led or just laid down. So if that was tile number 23, you would look up on the chart here and you would see that you found a chest. So then you would take your chest deck. If you wanted, you could lay that out, but you would take a chest token there and put it down. Then if you had a key or some ability or something to open up that chest, then you could draw your card to see what you found in the chest. There are also bodies you can discover and debris you can discover, and it just takes a single action point to investigate the body or the debris. And when you do, you're going to take a look at your body deck, and you're going to draw a card and you're going to see what you discover. Sometimes there might be bad things, like that body is a reanimated corpse of a zombie. You might have an event here, which you have a little narrative story to read, and then maybe something else to do, maybe a little decision you have to make. Sometimes you will discover traps and creatures and just different things that happen. So there is a pretty good variety of things that can happen while you are exploring. And the 4 different ways that you discover things will make each scenario play differently. You can play the same scenario multiple times and have very different experiences. In addition to the standard side, there's also a hard side, which just really increases the amount of times that a missed card is going to be drawn. And that is a deck, again, another risk deck. And these are usually pretty bad things that are going to happen to your heroes. Usually this is where you get ambushed and you have to fight a whole bunch of monsters and that kind of thing. So drawing a missed card is almost never a good thing, but it does lead to the excitement of the game. And so as you are moving throughout the dungeon and laying the dungeon down, you are going to be, often you will be drawing from a large stack of 30 tiles that you shuffle. Sometimes, in certain scenarios, you will take this stack of tiles and you will divide that up into cardinal directions. So when you explore north, you draw from one stack. When you explore south, you draw from another. East from one, west from one. So that's really cool. And depending on how you have shuffled your deck of tiles, the dungeon is going to look very different and play very different. As you can see, this dungeon here, where you always start in the start tile, was very like east to west orientated. There was hardly any northern expansion to this dungeon. And the way this dungeon was built out was I started here, I went over here, went here, went north, dead end, had to come back, backtrack, came here, dead end, because in most scenarios you can't build south from the starting tile. Well, then I came back here, I went up, I went north, then I went east, dead end. I had to come back here, I had to go here. This was a long corridor. I explored here, went up, finally was able to go north, dead end. And so this dungeon was all like east to west layout. I played this exact same scenario once before, and the dungeon was very different. It was more like a square shape with lots of open passages. There weren't a lot of dead ends. So it is really cool the way that the dungeon lays out and how that affects the gameplay. It will increase backtracking. It will make running from the dungeon lords, from the bosses, more difficult. It'll make you have to play the same scenario in a different way. And that is something that I really enjoy about this game. Another thing I enjoy about this game is the use of the threat meter. And I'm just calling this out just so people know that I am not always 100% against time limits in games or timers. And I think that this game uses its timer in a really creative way. So when you start the game, you're going to look at how many heroes are playing, from 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And then I was playing with 2 heroes, so I put one of these red tokens there. And the threat meter is at 14. Now there are different ways that you lower the threat meter. You do that by running or discovering a new dungeon tile, by beginning combat, or if the dungeon lord, if the boss is not out on the map yet and anything tells you to draw a dungeon lord card, you don't draw a dungeon lord card, you lower the threat meter. And as the threat meter starts working its way towards 0, as you are building out the dungeon, as you are exploring, as you are laying more dungeon tiles, it will eventually reach 0. At that point, you discard the threat meter. The timer has run out, but that's not the end of the game. That's basically the end of Act 1. At that point, you have explored enough. You have gone deep into this dungeon, awakening its boss, making things more dangerous for you, making things more perilous in your ability to solve the quest. And at that point, then you start drawing dungeon lord cards whenever you do something that triggers the drawing of a dungeon lord card. And what's really cool about that is each hero will have different things that they do that attract the attention of the dungeon lord. So the monk here, the only thing that he can do is if he starts combat, then you have to draw a dungeon lord card. So that's pretty cool. But old Indolf here, the paladin, he is a noisy guy. He's clunking around in this plate mail armor. You know, he's yelling for his god. He attracts the dungeon lord in many more ways. If he starts combat, if he runs, and every time he moves. And you just put a little token on that to remind yourself that you've done those things. And then at the end of that turn, you draw a Dungeon Lord card. And the first thing you do is you look at the number here, 14. If number 14 tile is out on the board, then the Dungeon Lord spawns in that tile. If it's not, you ignore it. And so that is really cool because as soon as Act 2 starts, the more you have to explore to find what you need to solve your quest, the greater the chance of the Dungeon Lord, of the boss, coming into the game is. I think that is an excellent idea, an excellent mechanism. It builds tension. It's using a timer to build tension, not to bake in an artificial end to the game. And then once the Dungeon Lord is out on the board, then whenever you have to draw a Dungeon Lord tile, it's going to tell you, or a Dungeon Lord card, it's going to tell you what how the Dungeon Lord moves, the hero that it's moving towards, its target, and then you will have to eventually either evade or fight the Dungeon Lord. Beating these guys is incredibly difficult. So really what you want to do is you want to try to solve your quest before this guy even comes out. Or once he comes out, you want to solve the quest quickly and then get back to the exit and escape with your life. That was then the way that the different risk decks are handled. I kind of talked about that in conjunction with the way that the random tiles are laid out. But these risk decks, that's a hard thing to say, really do add a lot of variety to the game. So you are moving around, you are exploring, you are looking at bodies to try to find different things. There are quite a few different things you can find. Sometimes you can find items. Like I said, you can find zombies, little stories you can read, just little events that happen that aren't necessarily just combat. So I like that. And I like that there are 4 different decks. The only one that I am a little disappointed in is the chest deck because it's mainly just gold. There are a couple little side quests that you can find in the treasure deck, but for the most part you're just kind of finding gold. So a little kind of boring. I wish there was more things to get excited about in this chest deck. But the other decks, there are a lot of things to get excited about, and it just does a lot to kind of strengthen that name of the Dungeons of Infinity, of lots of random things happening. But it's not just a random luck fest. This isn't Dungeon Quest. There is actually a lot of tactical decisions to make, a lot of strategy to make, how you're going to use your action points, how you are going to explore the dungeon. Just different elements that you do have to think about, but it still adds this element of randomness that keeps things exciting and adds that element of excitement to the cool puzzle-like elements that are also baked into the game. And that is really the thing that I like the most about this game, is the variety. And a lot of that has to do with the scenarios and how the scenarios are laid out. So you get a giant book of scenarios and campaign stuff here. And the first part of this book here has all of your standalone scenarios. And I think there's about 12 of them. There's the coin quest, the orb quest, sentinel hunt to catch a wisp, search and destroy, dungeon lord capture, rogue agent, run for your life, tip of the spear, dark magic, and then these are little mini campaigns, the orbs of power and the dungeon lord capture mini campaign. Now all of these can be played cooperatively or competitively, and even with a single hero, true like lone wolf solo mode. And these, it tells you your rules. These are pretty simple. Most of these you're going to be building a random dungeon, or maybe all of them. You usually have something you have to go out and find, whether it be kind of a mini boss or a certain item, and then get it back to the entrance. Some of them do offer up a little more variety than that, but there are some special rules, some special setups. But there is a lot of different single one-off scenarios. Now, what you can also do is there are also rules for creating mini campaigns. And what those are is you can take any of these 3 standalone scenarios and combine them together to create a 3 dungeon mini campaign. very cool. Like I said, competitive or cooperative. And from what I can tell, I think the game would work fine in both ways. I haven't played it in a competitive way, but I think that it would be really fun to do so. Kind of like maybe like Dungeon Run at that point. But then it also has three little mini campaigns built in here, which will have three different dungeons that you have to do with some special rules. You will have your mini campaign options. And then once you have played some of those, maybe you want to go ahead and tackle the huge, just absolutely huge narrative campaign that has 10 chapters. Now in this game there are 10 different heroes, and so each chapter focuses on a hero that you will have to play during that campaign or that chapter, but then you can also play with the other heroes that maybe you want to join him or her on their questing party. This has some rules about how you're going to set up your campaigns. There is a deck of campaign cards that at certain points you will be mixing these into your different risk decks. And oftentimes the campaign missions will have you create a custom deck to experience during that certain chapter or dungeon. Now each of the chapters is broken into, I believe it's 3 dungeons, so 3 parts of each chapter. And what you're going to have is usually you will have a pre-constructed deck or a pre-constructed dungeon that you're going to have to go through. And this is going to tell you your setup rules, what you're going to set up for each of the cards, and what you're going to need for your dungeon map layout. The second dungeon is usually going to be a randomly generated dungeon where you're going to be drawing from stacks of tiles. And then the third dungeon in each chapter is usually a pre-constructed dungeon, but it also has a series of narrative events that you can go through making decisions. There are some like math puzzles in there because Jack the designer, he is a mathematician by trade, and you can kind of tell while playing this game. But this is really cool. It adds just these different story events that you're going to read that are going to flesh out the backstory and the personality of the hero on which this chapter is focusing on. And that is really cool. I like that a lot. And there are a lot of different elements that go into each of these chapters. And I'm really looking forward to diving into this campaign. It is one of the most interesting looking campaign systems I have seen in a dungeon crawl. And it's not just a campaign. So this game really does give you a variety of choice. You can play standalone missions. You can play little tiny campaigns to upgrade your character even a little bit more, or you can dive into that big epic campaign. You can play full solo lone wolf mode. You can play competitively, or you can play cooperatively. So I think Dungeons of Infinity, it does really try to offer that infinity part of the title. However, there are some things I don't like. And unfortunately, a lot of that has to do with the documentation. There is a lot of errata for this game already. And one thing I am a little worried about starting the story campaign is I don't think people have finished it yet, so I'm not sure how many errors there are going to be in that, if there's anything game-breaking. I'm not sure. The number of errors and errata so far doesn't fill me with a ton of confidence, but what does kind of alleviate some of my issues is that Jack is answering all questions quickly, promptly, and he's there for us when we need it. The list of errata so far, like tons of misprints in the rulebook about how many cards, the component count. There are a few so far. People have discovered some campaign guide errors, different rules. So this is like kind of continuing to grow as the game gets in more and more people's hands. So that is really unfortunate. There are quite a few misprints on cards. For instance, this Infinity Scroll, just real quickly, if you were to use this scroll, it would add 2 to your hero's power, 2 to their defense. Okay, that's good. But then this here, this symbol here means that this adds 3 to the enemy's chance to hit you. Well, that's actually supposed to be a white symbol, which makes it easier for you to hit the enemies. So if you were to use this card as written, it would actually benefit the monsters and you at the same time. So that's unfortunate. All of the bows, they forgot to write that the bows were two-handed. There are a lot of things like that in the game. There are a lot of little errors that kind of add up and do spoil the time you're spending with the game a little bit, and they don't add that kind of confidence that you want when going into a big campaign. So that is really unfortunate. I hope that Jack can get everything worked out for a second edition. I also have trouble with the rule book. So the game asks you to read this first. This is a quick start guide. It has a little bit of setup, and then this walks you through a few turns of a sample scenario. And it's okay, it's pretty good. But then when you're done, you think, okay, well, I've learned like what this tutorial wants me to learn, but I still don't really know how to play the game when I'm on my own. Well, now I'm going to read the actual rulebook and learn everything. Well, the actual rulebook really isn't a rulebook. It's just a reference guide, and it just lists all the rules in alphabetical order. I see that Jack was attempting to do kind of like the Arkham Horror 3rd edition thing, the new FFG thing where you have a learn to play and a reference guide. However, with Arkham Horror 3rd edition and newer FFG games, the learn to play guide is actually pretty good, and you actually do learn how to play. I don't feel like this quick start guide did enough to teach me how to play. So then I just had to read through all of the rules in alphabetical order in order to learn. And that's a really terrible way to learn how to play a game, because trying to connect the rules that are connected, trying to put them in a play order is very difficult. So this game did take me quite a long time to learn. It's not a very difficult game, but there are different things going on. There are different elements that do make it more difficult to learn than I would like. And so hopefully we can get that corrected. I would also like to see more minion variety. There's quite a few, but they're just not very exciting. The combat in this game is interesting in how you will be building like battle lines basically, and you can attack minions in the first row of a battle line. As you destroy them, then they will move down. So it is a very kind of an interesting system, but you only really have about 5 or so different groups of enemies, and they don't feel very different. And so I would like to see just a little more variety in the enemies. It's not too much of a problem. Where I think the problem really is in the mini bosses. There are only 5 different mini bosses that you can face off against in the game. So these are sentinels. I would like to see 5 more at least of those, just for some variety. And the base game, there are only 4 different bosses. There's one boss that you're going to face off against in the campaign, and then these 3 bosses here. So maybe a little bit more in the boss and sentinel area I would like to see. Just something to add a little bit more excitement. I would also like to see more gear available for purchase. So the weapons that you can purchase, I get it. They're like just level 1 kind of boring items, and it's good for the start of the game. But since so much of the stuff you get in the game in the chests is gold, it would be more fun to have some more exciting things to spend your gold on. These scrolls are good, and I think the scrolls are kind of a secret weapon to winning the game. You do want to get these scrolls, which are like spells, and use them. But sometimes I would often get gold, and I would just kind of look at what was available to purchase, and it didn't excite me. And so a lot of times I didn't end up spending my gold, spending my treasure money, because it just didn't seem like it was worth going back to that starting tile and interacting with the merchant there. And finally, I think maybe just an overall look of the game. It just looks a little bland. I think the iconography is okay, if a little inconsistent in places, but it doesn't fill me with excitement. It doesn't spark my imagination in the way that a lot of this game does. The look is just, it's serviceable and it's not bad, but it's not great. Again, this does remind me, and even in that way, of Dungeon Run, of like a really kind of early plaid hat game. This game does feel like it kind of came from the early 2000s, like maybe like 2006 to 2008. And I don't say that in a bad way, because it's kind of like it fell out of a time warp. And if it just had a little more like focus on the style of the way it looked. Just like the fact that these risk deck cards are just kind of like beige and brown, kind of boring looking. I would like to see maybe a little bit more flavor text on some of the items. Just those little hints, those little elements of spice that take a good game and elevate it to a great game. Because I think this game is so close to being a great game. And it's just a little unfortunate that there are some things that I think keep it from being great. But those are things that I think Jack could work on for the second edition. We talked about the heroes. I looked at the heroes in part 1 of this video series, and I like them a lot. I like all of their different powers. The fact that there are 10 different heroes in the base game is such a good value. I mean, you just get so much variety, and the fact that each one of them has its own deck of cards, all of the ways that the different ways that you're going to be building out your dungeons randomly, all of the different risk cards that you're going to be interacting with randomly, the way that the dungeon will populate with those risks will change depending on which card you draw. If you're looking for that kind of classic dungeon crawl game that has just a ton of elements that every time you play, things are going to feel different. And you can play, like I said, you can play a standalone scenario. You can play a small campaign. You can dive into the huge mega campaign. If you're looking for a game that has a lot of variety, a lot of things that fit inside one single box without having to store a bunch of minis and worry about how much shelf space, yeah, this is a game to look for. And I highly encourage people to pay attention to when the new Kickstarter comes, because I think it's going to be good. And I think Jack is going to, I think the game's in good hands for the future. It's just too bad that it kind of came out just slightly half-baked a little bit, I think. But I'm excited for the future of Dungeons of Infinity. So, all right, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed this look at Dungeons of Infinity, and we will talk to you later. Bye-bye.